So there I was, Jake Martinez, sitting in the back row of advanced zoonobiology, trying to blend in with a classroom full of aliens who thought I was basically the galactic equivalent of a rabid wolverine. Which, you know, really does wonders for your self-esteem when you're just trying to get your degree in interspecies relations. Let me paint you a picture here. Galactic University, the most prestigious educational institution in 3 spiral arms, where the brightest minds from across the galaxy come to learn. And then there's me, the scholarship kid from Earth, who somehow managed to convince the admissions board that humans weren't actually planning to eat everyone. Spoiler alert, we're not. Most of the time. The classroom itself looked like something out of a fever dream. Picture stadium seating, but designed by committee of species who clearly never had to worry about things like comfort or not falling to your death. My desk was this weird crystalline structure that kept trying to read my emotional state, which was incredibly awkward because my emotional state was mostly, why did I think this was a good idea, mixed with, I really need coffee. My classmates were your typical galactic overachievers. There was Zephyr, this bird-like aviax who literally took notes with her talons and made me feel bad about my handwriting. She had these incredible iridescent feathers that shifted colors when she was concentrating, which was constantly, because apparently being a perfectionist is a universal trait. Then you had Glob, and yes, that was actually his name. He was what you'd call a gelatinous species, basically a sentient pile of purple jello, who could reshape himself at will. Super useful for reaching the top shelf, terrible for shaking hands. He was actually pretty cool once you got past the whole blob person thing, but he had this habit of stress-eating his own limbs during exams, which was both fascinating and deeply disturbing. The real character, though, was Professor Klaxon. Picture a 9-foot-tall praying mantis who discovered theatrical acting and decided to make it everyone else's problem. He had these compound eyes that could apparently see your soul, or at least your browser history, and mandibles that clicked when he was annoyed, which was often, especially when looking at me. See, here's the thing about humans that apparently the rest of the galaxy missed in their cultural briefings. We're really not that scary. Sure, we're persistence predators, and yeah, we can eat damn near anything without dying, but mostly we just want to pet things and maybe take a nap. But try explaining that to a classroom full of species whose idea of aggression is strongly worded interdimensional memos. Professor Klaxon had this delightful habit of using me as a living example of predatory behavior whenever possible. Notice how the human sits in the back row, he'd announce, his voice carrying that special kind of academic condescension that transcends species barriers. Classic ambush positioning. Observe the relaxed posture, the seemingly casual scan of potential prey. Sorry, classmates. And I'm sitting there thinking, dude, I sit in the back because your voice is really loud and I have sensitive hearing, not because I'm planning to hunt anyone. Also, I'm scanning the room because I'm trying to figure out if Tentacle McGillicuddy in the 3rd row is taking better notes than me, not because I'm selecting targets. But here's where it gets really fun. Despite being absolutely terrified of me, my classmates were also weirdly fascinated. Like, they'd scatter if I stood up too quickly, but they'd also cluster around after class asking questions about human behavior. Is it true that humans can survive on nothing but caffeine and spite? Do you really bite your enemies to establish dominance? Why do you show your teeth when you're happy? It's terrifying. I tried explaining that smiling is actually a friendly gesture, not a threat display, but that just made them more nervous. Apparently, most species in the galaxy don't bear their dental equipment unless they're planning to use it, which explains why my attempts at being friendly kept clearing out the cafeteria. The worst part was how they'd whisper about me when they thought I couldn't hear them. Newsflash, humans have pretty decent hearing, especially when someone's discussing whether or not you're planning to eat them. Spoiler alert number 2. I'm lactose intolerant and have trouble with spicy food, so my diet is way less intimidating than they think. But Professor Klaxon, oh, he loved having a real live human in his class. Today we'll be studying predator-prey relationships, he'd announce with obvious glee, his mandibles practically vibrating with excitement. And we have a perfect example right here in our midst. Then he'd gesture at me with one of his forearms while I sat there wondering if it was too late to change my major to something less humiliating, like interpretive dance or advanced bureaucracy. The really ironic part? I was actually doing pretty well in the class. Turns out, when you're the only member of your species in a room full of aliens, you pay attention to behavioral patterns, whether you want to or not. Self-preservation and good grades, 2 birds with 1 stone. But I had no idea that Professor Klaxon was planning something special for today's lesson. Something that would definitely cement my reputation as the galaxy's most terrifying exchange student, even though all I really wanted was to pass the class and maybe make one friend who didn't flinch when I yawned. So there I was, minding my own business and trying to decipher my notes from last week's lecture on symbiotic relationships in low-gravity environments, when Professor Claxon practically pirouetted into the classroom. And I mean that literally. The guy did this weird spinning entrance thing that made his lab coat flare out dramatically, like he was auditioning for Galactic Dancing with the Stars. "Students," he announced, his voice carrying that special theatrical tremor that meant someone was about to have a very bad day. "Today we have a truly special treat." I should have known right then that I was doomed. In my experience, whenever a teacher says, "You're getting a special treat," what they really mean is, "I'm about to traumatize you for educational purposes." Claxon gestured toward the back of the classroom with 3 of his forearms, because apparently regular dramatic pointing wasn't enough. 2 maintenance drones wheeled in what looked like a containment unit the size of a small refrigerator, all gleaming metal and ominous humming sounds. The thing had more warning labels than a nuclear power plant, written in 17 different galactic languages. I could only read about half of them, but the ones I could understand were not encouraging. Things like extreme caution, authorized personnel only, and my personal favorite, may cause existential dread. The entire class went dead silent. Even Glob stopped his nervous fidgeting, which was saying something because that guy never stopped moving. Zephyr's feathers went from their usual academic blue to what I was starting to recognize as her oh crap shade of yellow. "Inside this containment unit," Professor Claxon continued, now pacing back and forth like he was delivering a monologue from Hamlet, "we have a live specimen of one of the galaxy's most feared apex predators. Great. Just great." I had a sinking feeling I knew where this was going. "The Fluffernox," he proclaimed, pausing for what was obviously supposed to be dramatic effect. "A creature so terrifying, so ruthlessly efficient, that entire civilizations have developed their defense strategies around avoiding them." Now, I'd heard of Fluffernoxes before, required reading for my Dangerous Species course last semester. According to the textbook, they were these massive, aggressive predators from the Outer Rim territories, known for their lightning-fast reflexes and complete lack of mercy. The book had described them as nature's perfect killing machine, and the reason nightlights were invented on 47 different worlds. But here's the thing about textbooks. They're not always great with the visual aids. By the time Professor Claxon began entering his security codes into the containment unit, each beep echoing through the silent classroom like a countdown to doom, my classmates were literally holding their breath. I could see Tentacle McGillicuddy in the 3rd row, turning a shade of blue that probably wasn't healthy for his species. "Now, observe carefully," Claxon said, his mandibles clicking with excitement. "Watch how it immediately assesses the room for threats and potential prey." The containment unit hissed open with a sound like the galaxy's most ominous soda can. A cloud of preservation mist billowed out dramatically, because of course it did. Everyone leaned forward, waiting for this terrible apex predator to emerge. What stumbled out of the mist was essentially a 3-foot-tall space hamster. I'm not even exaggerating here. Picture the fluffiest, roundest, most absolutely adorable rodent you've ever seen, but scaled up to the size of a golden retriever, and covered in fur that looked like it was made from cotton candy and stardust. It had these huge, dark eyes that took up about half its face, tiny little paws, and ears that were way too big for its head. The apex predator took one look at the classroom full of staring aliens, made a sound that can only be described as a cross between a squeak and a whimper, and immediately started crying. Not like scary predator crying, like lost puppy at the mall crying. The silence in the classroom was deafening. You could literally hear Globe's confusion manifesting as tiny bubble-popping sounds. "Fascinating," Professor Claxon said, though his voice had lost some of its theatrical confidence. "Notice how it uses vocalizations to disorient potential threats." The Fluffernox looked around the room with those enormous tear-milled eyes, spotted all the staring aliens, and promptly flopped down on the floor in what was unmistakably a panic attack. Its little chest was heaving, its ears were pressed flat against its head, and it was making these tiny, heartbroken, whimpering noises that would have melted the heart of anyone who wasn't completely terrified. Which, unfortunately, described everyone in the room except me. My classmates were frozen in terror, staring at this fluffy little creature like it was about to sprout tentacles and start devouring souls. Zephyr had gone completely white, her feathers standing on end. Glob had actually partially liquefied from stress, which was new. And there I was, looking at what was obviously just a scared, fluffy animal, thinking that someone really needed to update the textbooks. "See how it positions itself for maximum tactical advantage," Professor Claxon continued desperately, trying to salvage his lesson plan. And those vocalizations clearly designed to lower our guard before it strikes. The Fluffernox chose that moment to curl up in a little ball and start sucking on its own paw for comfort. Yeah, real terrifying there, Professor. Now what happened next is something that I'm pretty sure they're going to be talking about in Galactic University legend for the next few centuries, and not in a good way for Professor Klaxon's teaching career. The Fluffernox, still curled up in its little ball of fluff and existential crisis, suddenly lifted its head and looked around the room again. Those massive eyes swept across the sea of terrified alien faces, each one staring at it like it was about to spontaneously combust into pure death. And you know what? I actually felt bad for the little guy. Imagine being the center of attention when all you want to do is find a nice corner to hide in and maybe get a snack. But then those big dark eyes landed on me. And I swear, I could see the exact moment when this creature's tiny brain made what was probably the worst tactical decision in galactic history. Its ears perked up. Its eyes got somehow even bigger, and it made this little chirping sound that was pure relief. See, here's what I think happened. The Fluffernox looked around, saw a room full of aliens who were clearly terrified of it, and then spotted the one being in the room who was just sitting there looking completely calm and unthreatened. From its perspective, I probably looked like the safest person in the room. From everyone else's perspective, this apex predator had just identified its primary target. The Fluffernox unrolled itself, stood up on its stubby little legs, and started waddling directly toward me with the determination of a creature who had finally found salvation. The reaction from my classmates was immediate and spectacular. Zephyr let out a shriek that probably shattered glass on 3 nearby planets, and launched herself straight up into the air, hovering near the ceiling with her wings beating frantically. Glob made this horrified gurgling sound and immediately started flowing toward the exit, leaving a trail of stressed purple goop behind him. Tentacle McGillicuddy just fainted, which honestly seemed like a reasonable response at this point. "Nobody move," Professor Klaxon commanded, his voice cracking slightly. It selected its prey. Any sudden movements might trigger its hunting instincts. Meanwhile, I'm sitting there watching this ball of fluff waddle toward me like a toddler who's just spotted their favorite stuffed animal, and I'm thinking, hunting instincts? The only thing this creature might hunt is a particularly elusive snack cracker. The Fluffernox reached my desk, looked up at me with those enormous trusting eyes, and made a soft little trill sound that was clearly the universal language for, "Please help me, everything is terrible and I don't understand what's happening." Then it did something that made the entire room gasp in horror. It climbed up onto my desk. Now, from my perspective, this was adorable. Like a cat deciding you're worthy of attention, except fluffier and with more existential anxiety. The little guy settled himself right between me and my notes, curled up in a ball, and started making these soft, contented purring sounds. From everyone else's perspective, the apex predator had just claimed territory and was preparing to feed. "Martinez," Professor Klaxon whispered, like speaking too loudly might cause me to spontaneously explode. "Do not make any sudden movements. It's displaying classic pre-hunting behavior." I looked down at the Fluffernox, who had closed its eyes and was now gently snoring, one tiny paw twitching in what was probably a dream about finding a really good hiding spot. "Professor," I said carefully, "I think there might be some kind of mistake here." "No," he hissed back, his compound eyes fixed on the sleeping ball of fluff. "This is exactly what we expected. It's using its advanced camouflage techniques to appear non-threatening before it strikes." The Fluffernox chose that moment to roll over onto its back, exposing its fluffy belly and making tiny squeaking sounds of contentment. If this was camouflage, it was the most effective cute-based stealth system ever developed. "It's showing me its stomach," I pointed out. "That's usually a sign of trust, not aggression." "Psychological warfare," Professor Klaxon declared with the confidence of someone who was definitely not going to admit his lesson plan was falling apart. "It's trying to lower your guard by appearing vulnerable." I reached out slowly to pet the Fluffernox's belly, because honestly it looked really soft and I have poor impulse control when it comes to fluffy things. The collective gasp from my classmates was audible from orbit. The moment my hand made contact with that impossibly soft fur, the Fluffernox's eyes snapped open and it looked up at me with what I can only describe as pure adoration. It grabbed onto my hand with its tiny paws, holding on like I was the best thing that had ever happened to it, and started making these happy little chirping sounds. "My God," whispered Zephyr from her position near the ceiling. "It's playing with its food." "Actually," I said, gently scratching behind the Fluffernox's oversized ears, which made it purr even louder. "I think it just wants some affection. Look at it, it's practically melting." And it was. The little creature had gone completely limp with contentment, sprawled across my desk like the world's fluffiest paperweight, making sounds of pure bliss as I scratched its ears. Professor Claxon stared at this scene with the expression of someone watching their carefully planned lecture turn into an impromptu petting zoo. "This is," he began, then stopped, clearly trying to figure out how to spin this into something that matched his original lesson plan. "This is highly unusual behavior." The Fluffernox, apparently deciding that my desk was now the safest place in the galaxy, stretched out even more and started grooming itself with the casual contentment of a creature who had found its person. And that's when I realized that I had just become the galaxy's most feared predator's emotional support human. Now here's where things get really interesting, because apparently I have what you might call a weakness for cute, distressed animals. It's not my fault, okay? It's hardwired into human DNA or something. Show me something fluffy that's having a bad day, and my brain immediately switches into what I like to call nurture mode. My mom always said it would get me in trouble someday. She just never specified it would be in front of an audience of aliens who thought I was about to demonstrate advanced hunting techniques. The Fluffernox had settled into this perfect little loaf shape on my desk, with its paws tucked under its body and its tail wrapped around itself like a furry donut. Every few seconds, it would make these soft little contented sounds that were basically the galactic equivalent of a cat's purr, except somehow even cuter. Which, scientifically speaking, should have been impossible. But here's the thing that really got to me. Every time someone in the classroom moved or made a noise, the little guy would tense up and look around nervously, like it was expecting something terrible to happen. Then it would look back at me with those enormous eyes, seeking reassurance that it was still safe. And that's when my brain made what was definitely going to go down in history as either the sweetest or most terrifying decision of my academic career. I started talking to it. "Hey there, little guy," I said softly, continuing to scratch behind its ears. "You're okay now. Nobody's going to hurt you." The reaction from my classmates was immediate and dramatic. Zephyr, still hovering near the ceiling, made a choking sound and whispered, "It's communicating with it. Oh my stars, it's establishing dominance through vocal commands." The Fluffernox, meanwhile, perked up at the sound of my voice and started making these happy little chirping responses, like it was trying to have a conversation with me. Which, let's be honest, was probably exactly what it was doing. "That's right," I continued, "because apparently I'm incapable of not talking to cute animals, even when surrounded by aliens who think I'm demonstrating predatory behavior. You're such a good boy, aren't you? Yes, you are. Such a brave little explorer." Professor Claxon's mandibles were clicking so fast they sounded like a machine gun. "Martinez," he hissed, "what are you doing?" "I'm comforting it," I said, which was the absolute truth, even if it probably wasn't the answer he was looking for. "It's obviously stressed and scared. Look at how it's responding to gentle treatment." The Fluffernox had indeed perked up considerably. It was now sitting up straighter, its ears forward and alert, making these soft, trilling sounds that were clearly expressions of happiness. When I held out my hand, it immediately nuzzled against my palm with the trust of a creature who had decided I was officially the best thing ever. "Fascinating," breathed Glob from his position near the door, though he was still maintaining what he clearly considered a safe distance. "The human appears to be using some kind of psychological manipulation technique." "It's called being nice," I said, gently stroking the Fluffernox's incredibly soft fur. "Watch this." I cupped my hands and made a little nest shape, and the Fluffernox immediately curled up inside them, fitting perfectly like it was meant to be there. The collective intake of breath from my classmates was probably audible from space. "It's allowing the human to capture it," whispered Tentacle McGillicuddy, who had apparently recovered from his fainting spell. "This must be some kind of advanced human hunting strategy we've never seen before." The Fluffernox, completely oblivious to being captured, had closed its eyes and was making the most contented purring sounds I'd ever heard. It was like holding a warm, living stuffed animal that was powered by pure happiness. "Look," I said, trying to explain to a room full of terrified aliens that this was literally just basic animal care. "It's not being captured, it's being petted. This is what humans do with small, cute animals. We give them affection and make them feel safe." "But why?" asked Zephyr from her ceiling perch, sounding genuinely confused. "What do you gain from this behavior?" I looked down at the Fluffernox, who had opened one eye to gaze up at me with what could only be described as adoration, then closed it again with a tiny sigh of contentment. "I don't gain anything," I said. "It just makes us both feel good." The silence that followed this statement was the kind of profound quiet that usually precedes either enlightenment or complete civilizational collapse. Professor Claxon cleared his throat with a sound like a chainsaw starting up. "This is highly irregular," he announced. Predators don't typically engage in nurturing behavior toward their prey. That's because it's not prey, I pointed out, gently repositioning the fluffernox so it was more comfortable in my hands. It's just a scared animal that needed some kindness, right, buddy? The fluffernox opened both eyes, looked directly at me and made a soft sound that was unmistakably agreement, followed by what I swear was the interspecies equivalent of, thank you. Then it did something that made the entire room gasp in horror. It licked my nose. Just a tiny, gentle lick, with a tongue that felt like velvet, followed by a happy little chirp that clearly meant, I like you, food giver and comfort provider. My God, breathed Professor Claxon. It's marking its territory. The human has been claimed. I couldn't help it. I started laughing. Not evil villain laughter, or predatory chuckling, just genuine amusement at the complete absurdity of the situation. Here I was, holding what was essentially the galaxy's most misunderstood hamster, while a room full of supposedly intelligent beings interpreted basic affection as some kind of advanced hunting ritual. The fluffernox, apparently deciding that my laughter was the best sound it had ever heard, started making happy little chirping sounds in harmony with me, like it was trying to laugh along. You see, I said to the room at large, it's happy, it's safe, it's exactly where it wants to be. And that's when Professor Claxon made his next big mistake. So Professor Claxon, clearly deciding that his carefully planned lesson had gone completely off the rails and needed some aggressive course correction, strode forward with all the confidence of someone who was about to make a spectacularly bad decision. Enough, he announced, his voice carrying that particular tone of academic authority that means someone's about to do something they'll regret for educational purposes. This demonstration has deviated far enough from the intended curriculum. Martinez, return the specimen to its containment unit immediately. Now the fluffernox had been dozing peacefully in my hands, making tiny snoring sounds that were basically the auditory equivalent of cotton candy. But the moment Professor Claxon raised his voice, those big ears snapped to attention, and the little guy went rigid with fear. I felt him start trembling. And that's when something shifted in my brain. Not the scary predator thing my classmates kept expecting, but something much more fundamentally human. That protective instinct that kicks in when you see something small and helpless being threatened. The same thing that makes people adopt stray cats and yell at teenagers who kick over sandcastles. He's scared, I said, instinctively curling my hands more protectively around the fluffernox. Look at him. He's shaking. Professor Claxon's compound eyes fixed on me with what I was starting to recognize as his, I am the teacher and you are disrupting my authority look. The creature's emotional state is irrelevant to the educational objectives of this lesson. Return it to containment. The fluffernox made a tiny whimpering sound and burrowed deeper into my hands, clearly trying to make itself as small as possible, which, given that it was already basically a ball of fluff with eyes, was pretty impressive. No, I said. The word came out before I really thought about it, but once it was out there, I realized I meant it completely. This wasn't some terrifying apex predator that needed to be contained for everyone's safety. This was just a scared, lonely little creature who had finally found someone who made it feel safe. And I wasn't about to let Professor Claxon drag it back to what was essentially solitary confinement for the crime of being misunderstood. The silence that followed my refusal was the kind of profound quiet that usually happens right before someone declares war or announces the end of the universe. Professor Claxon's mandibles stopped clicking entirely, which somehow was more ominous than when they'd been going a mile a minute. Excuse me? I said no, I repeated, standing up from my desk while carefully keeping the fluffernox secure in my hands. You brought him out to scare everyone, but he's not scary. He's terrified. Look at him. I held up my hands slightly so everyone could see the fluffernox, who had wrapped his tiny paws around my thumb and was holding on like it was the only solid thing in a universe gone mad. His eyes were wide and frightened, darting between Professor Claxon and the containment unit, like he understood exactly what was being discussed. The specimen's behavioral responses are not the point of this exercise, Professor Claxon said, taking a step forward. The educational objective is to observe predator classification and threat assessment protocols. Educational objective? I could feel my voice getting that edge it gets when I'm about to do something, probably stupid but definitely necessary. You mean terrifying a harmless animal for dramatic effect? Real educational, Professor. The fluffernox made a soft trilling sound and nuzzled against my palm, clearly seeking reassurance, which just made me more determined to keep him safe. Martinez, Professor Claxon said, his voice taking on a warning tone. You are disrupting the educational environment and interfering with official university research protocols. Return the specimen immediately or face academic disciplinary action. And that's when I discovered something interesting about myself. Apparently, when someone threatens a small, helpless creature that's depending on me for protection, I don't really care about academic disciplinary action. I don't care about grades, or scholarships, or even my future career prospects. I care about doing the right thing. Make me, I said. The collective gasp from my classmates was probably detectable by deep space monitoring stations. Zephyr actually fell out of the air from sheer shock, caught herself, and immediately started hovering again, but higher this time. Professor Claxon's entire posture shifted. His forearms spread wide, his head lowered, and suddenly he didn't look like an eccentric academic anymore. He looked like what he actually was under all that theatrical nonsense. A 9-foot-tall, predatory insect, with razor-sharp mandibles and reflexes faster than human eyesight. "Martinez," he said, his voice dropping to a growl that made the whole room vibrate. "You will comply with this directive, or I will remove the specimen from you by force." The Fluffernox whimpered and pressed closer to me, and I could feel his tiny heart beating like a hummingbird's wings against my palm. That's when I realized something that probably should have occurred to me earlier. My classmates weren't just afraid of me because I was human. They were afraid of me because they genuinely believed I was dangerous, which meant that when I decided to protect something, they expected me to be really, really good at it. Time to not disappoint them. I straightened up to my full height, which at 6 feet 2 inches wasn't nearly as impressive as Professor Claxon's 9 feet. But apparently size isn't everything when you're dealing with a species that's convinced you're a walking nightmare. I shifted my stance, putting myself between the professor and the Fluffernox, and looked him directly in his compound eyes. "Professor," I said, my voice completely calm and level, "I'm going to explain this once, very clearly so there's no misunderstanding. This little guy is under my protection now. He's not going back in that box. He's not being used as a prop for your demonstrations. And if you try to take him from me, you're going to discover exactly why humans have the reputation we do." I wasn't shouting. I wasn't snarling or baring my teeth. I was just speaking with the quiet, absolute certainty of someone who had made a decision and wasn't going to be moved from it. The effect on the classroom was immediate and dramatic. Professor Claxon actually took a step backward, his mandibles clicking uncertainly. Globe had gone completely transparent from stress. Tentacle McGillicuddy was making notes so frantically that his appendages were blur, and Zephyr was now hovering so close to the ceiling that she was probably in the next floor up. But here's the really interesting part. The Fluffernox had stopped trembling. He was looking up at me with what I can only describe as awe, like he couldn't quite believe someone was actually standing up for him. Then he turned to look at Professor Claxon and made a sound that was unmistakably defiant. Like a tiny, fluffy battle cry. "You see that?" I said to the room at large. "He's not afraid anymore, because he knows he's safe. That's what protection actually looks like, Professor. Not containment, not control, just someone who cares enough to stand between you and the things that want to hurt you." Professor Claxon looked around the classroom, clearly realizing that he had somehow lost control of the situation entirely. His educational demonstration had turned into a face-off, with a human who was apparently willing to fight a 9-foot-tall predatory insect for the right to protect what amounted to the galaxy's most misunderstood hamster. "This is highly irregular," he muttered, but he didn't move forward again. The Fluffernox chirped happily and settled back into my hands, clearly considering the matter resolved in his favor. And that's when I realized that I had just accidentally established myself as the unofficial protector of anxious space creatures everywhere. The standoff continued for what felt like several geological ages, but was probably only about 30 seconds. Professor Claxon stood there with all the authority of someone whose lesson plan had not just derailed but had caught fire and launched itself into a different dimension entirely. I stood there, holding a purring space hamster, and wondering how exactly my Tuesday had turned into an interspecies diplomatic incident, and my classmates continued their impression of various forms of cosmic debris, frozen in fascinated terror. Finally, Professor Claxon's shoulders sagged in defeat, and he made a sound that was probably the mantis equivalent of a very long, very tired sigh. "This," he announced to the classroom, "is not how this demonstration was supposed to proceed." The Fluffernox, apparently deciding that the immediate danger had passed, poked his head up from my protective hands and chirped what sounded remarkably like agreement. Like he was saying, "Yeah, no kidding, bug guy. Your presentation skills need work." "Professor," I said carefully, because I figured I was probably already in enough trouble without adding insult to injury. Maybe the problem isn't with the demonstration. Maybe it's with the assumptions. His compound eyes swiveled toward me with the kind of mechanical precision that was either fascinating or deeply unnerving, depending on your perspective. Explain. I looked down at the Fluffernox, who was now grooming one of his tiny paws with the casual contentment of someone who had successfully acquired the best bodyguard in the galaxy. You called him an apex predator, but look at him. He's not hunting anything. He's not stalking or calculating or doing any of those predatory behaviors you talked about. He's just scared and looking for comfort. The textbooks clearly classify Fluffernoxes as aggressive territorial predators, Professor Claxon insisted, though his voice had lost most of its earlier conviction. Yeah, well, the textbooks also said humans eat our enemies to establish dominance, I pointed out. How's that working out for the accuracy rating? Glob, who had been slowly regaining his structural integrity during the conversation, made a bubbling sound that might have been laughter. The human raises a valid point regarding the reliability of current xenobiological classifications. The Fluffernox chose that moment to demonstrate just how terrifyingly predatory he was by yawning, showing off a set of tiny teeth that would have struggled to bite through a particularly tough piece of lettuce, then settling back down for what was obviously going to be another nap. Look, I continued, gently scratching behind his ears again. I think maybe the problem is that different species get classified as dangerous based on incomplete information. Like, humans got labeled as terrifying predators because we're persistent hunters who can survive on almost anything, but nobody bothered to mention that we're also social creatures who form emotional bonds with basically everything, including members of other species. And Fluffernoxes got labeled as apex predators because they're from the Outer Rim territories, which have a reputation for being dangerous, added Zephyr from her ceiling position, apparently feeling brave enough to contribute to the discussion. But maybe they're only territorial because their home environments are hostile. In a safe environment, they might be completely different. The little guy in my hands made a soft trilling sound that sounded like enthusiastic agreement with this assessment. Professor Claxon looked around the classroom, clearly realizing that his carefully planned lesson about predator identification had somehow turned into an impromptu discussion about the dangers of stereotyping entire species based on limited data. This is, he began, then stopped, clicked his mandibles thoughtfully, and started again. This is actually a rather more valuable lesson than I had originally intended. Does that mean I'm not in trouble for refusing to put him back in the box? I asked, because I really did need to pass this class. Professor Claxon's mandibles clicked in what I was learning to recognize as his thinking pattern. Martinez, in the interest of advancing our understanding of interspecies relationships and challenging preconceived notions about predatory behavior, I am prepared to consider this an unorthodox but educational demonstration. The Fluffernox opened one eye, looked directly at Professor Claxon, and made a sound that was unmistakably smug, like he was saying, "That's right, bug guy, I'm educational now." However, Professor Claxon continued, this raises certain practical questions about the specimen's continued care and housing. And that's when it hit me. The little guy had basically adopted me as his person. He was comfortable, happy, and clearly had no intention of going anywhere. But I lived in a dorm room that was barely big enough for me, let alone me plus an emotional space hamster. I could help, offered Glove unexpectedly. My dormitory pod has environmental controls that could accommodate a variety of atmospheric preferences. And I have been looking for a study partner who wouldn't judge my stress-eating habits. The Fluffernox perked up at this suggestion, apparently finding the idea of a gelatinous study buddy intriguing. And I could provide aerial reconnaissance for optimal nesting locations, added Zephyr, slowly descending from her ceiling position. I mean for educational observation purposes, to study interspecies cohabitation patterns. Tentacle McGillicuddy cleared his throat, or made whatever sound passes for throat clearing when you have tentacles instead of a proper respiratory system. The dormitory regulations do include provisions for emotional support animals, provided they're registered through the proper academic channels. I looked down at the Fluffernox, who was gazing up at me with those enormous trusting eyes, then around at my classmates, who were apparently volunteering to help take care of the galaxy's most misunderstood predator. So what you're saying, I said slowly, is that I just accidentally adopted a space hamster, and you all want to help me figure out how to keep him. The chorus of agreement from around the room was honestly pretty heartwarming. Professor Claxon clicked his mandibles in what I was choosing to interpret as approval. I believe this arrangement could provide valuable ongoing research opportunities in interspecies relationship dynamics. Consider it an independent study project. The fluffernox made a happy chirping sound and curled up in my hands with the satisfaction of someone who had successfully manipulated an entire classroom full of allegedly superior beings into providing him with the exact living situation he wanted. You know what the really funny part is? I said to the room at large. Everyone was worried about him being a dangerous predator, but it turns out he's the one who's been hunting this whole time. He just wasn't hunting for food. What was he hunting for? Asked Zephyr, now perched on the back of a nearby chair. I looked down at the contentedly purring ball of fluff in my hands. A family. And that's how I, Jake Martinez, the most feared exchange student in galactic university history, ended up as the proud owner of an emotional support apex predator who was actually just a very sophisticated space hamster with excellent people skills. My mom always said college would be a learning experience. She just never mentioned it would involve adopting alien wildlife and accidentally becoming an interspecies diplomat. But honestly, I wouldn't change a thing. Even if my Tuesday afternoon xenobiology class had somehow turned into the weirdest pet adoption story in 3 spiral arms. The fluffernox chirped happily in agreement, apparently reading my thoughts, then settled in for a well-deserved nap. After all, successfully domesticating an entire classroom of terrified aliens is exhausting work.